And so I learned about how important church culture was, because for a church to decide that they're going to give themselves to reaching lost people, outsiders, they have to be willing to die. And I watched a group of people do that.
Welcome to the Everywhere Podcast, a collection of interviews with leaders and pastors and everyday followers of Jesus who are living into the reality that Jesus changes everything, everywhere. Hey friends, on this episode of the podcast, I sit down and talk with Pastor Dr. Brian Wangler. To say this is one of my favorite episodes of the podcast would be an understatement. It was a fantastic time sitting down with Pastor Brian. His story of coming to faith and his call to ministry is so inspiring and so helpful. I hope that you get as much out of this conversation as I did. We sit down and talk about his early years in ministry, his processes of helping walk churches through growth periods and reaching families and reaching the lost. And we just talk about overall ministry and the aches and pains and the joys and triumphs and everything in between. This conversation was such a blessing to me, and I think it will be to you. Let's take a listen. Well, hello there, Pastor Brian Wangler. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on.
I'm super excited. So I was doing a little bit of YouTubing the other night, and I saw a video of you going skydiving.
That was a rough day, man.
What are you thinking, brother? Like,
we were paying off debt. So we in Ottawa, we had this skydive drop zone that was near us, one of the largest in the country. And we had about 50 or 60 grand left on the debt. And so, and there was a bunch of skydivers that attended the church, and they'd been on me to do it. And I said, well, if we pay off, in a certain amount of time, that's what we'll do. So we did. And then we dove into a picnic that the church was having, and we were landing where you're technically not supposed to go because it was near I-80, but these guys, they know what they're doing. But when we got up, the guy yells in my ear, hey, the guy I'm tandeming with, he goes, we got a problem. The way the wind's blowing, we're going to have to corkscrew in to land. And I'm like, well, I don't care. He's like, you might. But so I land, and all these kids are running up to me, and I am 98% sure I'm going to vomit all over everybody. I was so sick, man. But I don't think they caught that on video, so I think we're in good shape.
Very, very good shape. So you landed that's a great entrance for a church event.
It was fun. Yeah, it was fun.
All right. Well, hey, so we met each other in the Chicago Central District. One of the things I love just kind of watching from afar is you've had a lot of ministry success, if we could call it that. But you're super humble, and I really have appreciated just being around you and your humility. It's been fun. So I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thank you. We've had some fun. We've also had a lot of miscues, and those have kept me humble.
Well, there we go, man. All right, so let's talk about your faith story. What was your story of coming to faith in Christ?
Yes, I was raised in a Christian home. My mom and dad were Nazarene laity. They were the prototypical. We used to use the word churchman back in the day. I mean, dad was on the board. Mom was missionary president. They taught Sunday school. My dad. I mean, my growing up was how it's supposed to be, right? The home wasn't perfect, but it was, I had nothing in there that would have been anything but loving and just a great way to grow up. But when I got into high school, as I graduated from high school and went off to college, I just had never made the connection of my own the way that it should have been made spiritually. Yeah. And for a whole bunch of reasons, I did my Jonah impersonation. That's what I call it, where I just decide I'm going to go the other direction. And it's been about 10 years before the creature swallowed me up. and was very, very grateful when it vomited me out. Right. And by 8-9 years in, I had gone into business and had gotten married, but life had not worked. And I was an alcoholic by virtually any way that you measure it, and really thought that my life was over, that I'd blown it. I mean, I'm 20 something, but you know, the narrative that gets in your head is you've blown it, you've blown it, you've blown it. And you know, after work one night, we'd attended church a time or two at Danville Southside. Mike Stipp was the pastor. That was my home church. And really, it's that local church. That local church is the reason that not only am I in ministry today, that local church is the reason I'm alive today. And that local church is the reason I got to raise my kids. Wow. The reason my marriage survived. It's the reason that I get to do what I get to do and have gotten to do for a living, which is, you know, living a purpose that God had called me to for 30 years. I didn't come home from work one night, went out drinking with the guys. My wife really despondent because we were a mess, or I was a mess. And she just drove by the church, and the pastor happened to be in his study working on his sermon, so the light was on. So she stopped by and met with Mike Stipp, and at 9 o'clock the next morning, there I am, not in the best shape in the world, but with a pastor sitting at my kitchen table. And you know, the story is really even, she woke me up and said, "Hey, Pastor Mike's coming out at 9 o'clock to talk to you." And I'm like, no, we're not doing that. You know, yeah, we're doing that. So we argued a little bit. And when he came, I said, "Pastor, I'm really grateful that you'd be willing to come out and meet with me, but that you don't understand what's going on." And he said, "Just let me talk to you." I said, I gave him 5 minutes. I said, "You got 5 minutes." And I said it respectfully, but as respectfully as you can tell somebody you got 5 minutes, you know. So he came in and he asked me a question that was the pivot in many, many ways. He said, "I just want to know if you're happy." And I said, you already know I'm not, right? I mean, things are awful. And he said, "Well, the difference between me and you is I think you can be." And I said, "You don't understand." And nobody did. I mean, I had, as an addict, you know, there's just this dark hole that you go down into that people don't even realize how far your soul is gone, right? Right. How dead you are. And I had contemplated suicide. I mean, it was a real thing for me. And he said, he didn't quote that passage of scripture from Daniel, but ever since that day, when I can remember when I ran across that scripture sometime later, I went, "Oh, that was what Pastor Stipp said." When Nebuchadnezzar says, you know, "Here's my dream, tell me what this means," you know, and Daniel says, "There's nobody on earth that can do that, but there is a God in heaven who understands." And that was kind of what Pastor Mike told me. And so he didn't invite me to church that day, as I remember it. I don't think he prayed with me, and I know he didn't quote scripture. He simply said, I want to be your friend, and so what do you think you should do? You know, how big a problem is alcohol? And I said, "Well, it's a problem." And he said, "Well, maybe you should go to treatment." And I'm like, I had just started another job, which I started a lot of jobs back in those days. And I said, I can't show up. And, you know, he goes, "Well," and I said, I think I can do it. You know, and he goes, "Well, can we make a deal that we'll try it your way? And if it doesn't work, you'll do it my way." And he was with us like 4 or 5 hours that day, right? So we were far enough in the conversation, and I knew him because we'd went to church a few times and I liked him. And so he had kind of earned the right, you know, to say that to me. And I'm like, okay. And then woke up next morning, I go, "Well, we have to go to church today, Lindy." The preacher was out here all day. so we did, and it was 2 or 3 weeks in, and I just started. I mean, the church became my AA. I mean, the small groups that we did on Wednesday night, we would be in a group, and I was a prodigal to that church. So we were in a group with folks who had known me and loved me and prayed for me. Some of whom had tracked me down over the years. Every once in a while, I'd get a phone call and I wouldn't recognize the number, and it'd be, "Hey, Brian, this is so-and-so from the church, Dale Campbell. I'm just praying for you." Sister Ethel Harris was a lady from the church who never, I mean, so I got carried into church under a week old to a revival service, and my mom took me to the nursery and handed me to Ethel Harris, who was just a longtime member of Danville Southside. That lady would call me when I was on my Jonah journey. And I know she'd call my mom, and my mom would give her whatever number I was, using. And I'd answer the phone. It'd be Brian Dale. That's my middle name is Dale. Brian Dale, this is Sister Ethel. I'm just calling to tell you I love you. So we came back into that environment, and we'd be in a small group on Wednesday with some of the folks who've been praying for us, and they say, "Okay, it's prayer time. Share your need about what." And people say, "Pray for my kids," or "Pray for this." It'd come to me, and I'd throw up all over it. I mean, it was just like, "I don't think I can do this anymore. I just don't know." And they would encourage me. And then about 3 weeks in, a Sunday morning service, I don't remember what the pastor preached, which I've heard a million times. And I've always thought, just once it'd be nice if they'd remember, right? I don't remember, but he gave an altar call, and I stepped forward, and and God just did an amazing work. And then I was in, then it was like, "Pastor, how can I help?" And a few things happened. But I started really doing life with Mike Stipp and Karen, and we were over at their house Sunday nights after church, and they were doing counseling, and I just started following him around, and it's a long story, but there's several. I ended up getting on the board after a couple of years, and he went through a review, and I didn't understand any of that, and they were critical of him because he wasn't getting sacraments taken to the shut-ins. Well, this guy saved my life.
Yeah.
So I'm this new young board member who was a little cocky anyway, because I'm still learning, and I'm like, well, I knew why he didn't have time to go take stuff to the shut-ins, because he was tracking down guys like me, right? So I said, "Pastor Mike, can I do that for you?" And he's like, "You'd have to have a license. You got to have a license to do that." I'm like, "Well," and I had went back to school, so I was going to community college here in Danville, and I'm like, "Well, what do I got to do to get one of those?" And he goes, "Well, it's a local minister's license," and I'm like, "Well, I'll get one of those. I want to help," right? He's like, "Okay." So I go get a local minister's license, and the board looked at him funny and me funny, because it'd been maybe 2 years in. It was probably way too early. I didn't declare a call to preach. I just said, "I want to help with this." And so they give me a local license, and it wasn't within 6 months, and I've gone back to school. So I'm working for my brother, who owned a garbage business. I'm not driving a garbage truck. I'm hanging on the back of the garbage truck, and trying to find my way through, right? And loving it. To be honest with you, I'd spent all those years in business and in sales, and about the time I got saved, my brother offered me that job, and it was 3 years of working with him. He was a lifesaver. That gave me income during that time, and it gave me time just to figure out. So within 6 months, Mike goes, "You got to enroll in a course. You're gonna have to take some courses." And I'm like, "Okay." He goes, "The stuff you're taking at community college probably help with some of it, because it was the basics, right? But you really need a district license." This is within a year. I mean, this is so counter to everything. And I said, "Well, how do I get one of those?" And he's like, "Well, you got to complete a couple of these courses that you'll do, and then you got to go to Kankakee, and you got to meet with the district board of ministry." And I'm like, "Oh man, And literally in my mind, I'm just taking communion to the shut-ins. That's all we're doing, and I'm helping him. And I figured at that point in time, I figured I would be in some kind of ministry, but as is relatively common with addicts, a lot of us come out thinking that we're going to be counselors, right? I mean, because of what set us free and what's helped us, we're like, that's kind of what I was thinking. So Keith Bottles was the DS. My wife, I take a day off work. Lindy takes a day off work. We don't complete any paperwork. We just drive to the meeting. And Mike had talked to the district superintendent, and we were really active in the church. So Lindy was doing nursery, and I was just showing up anywhere I could because it was life to me. I mean, I had new life. I mean, the church was everything, right? And so the DS meets us outside, and he goes, "Brian, have you completed any application?" I'm like, "No, I didn't." He's like, "Well, you got to complete this." I'm looking at these questions, and I don't know what the questions are now. I think they're essentially the same, but have you ever been involved in church trouble? I think was one of the questions, or anything. Right. And I can remember going, I don't know what that is, but Dr. Bottles, if there's anything that you guys might think would preclude me, I probably did it. He's like, no, we're not really talking about that. We're talking about just, have you been involved like in a church split? Or no, I hadn't split any churches at that point in time. So he's like, just fill out the form and let me handle it. Okay. So we go into the meeting, and the people on the group that I met with were like, so first question, has God called you to be an evangelist or a pastor? And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm taking communion to the shut-ins, primarily, and I may do a counseling thing. And so they asked me like one more question, and Bottles goes, "You know what? I think we've had enough. Brian and Lindy, we're so grateful for you for coming up and for being part of this, and we're going to pray for you." And so he just cut it off, and we went out and we got a district license. I don't think any of that was right. I don't think any of it, but it was God just kind of opening doors. Well, then suddenly now I got to get serious about the school thing. And in there, I'm thinking, well, maybe I do have some kind of a call, but not pastor. So I'm serving in the local church. I'm working with my pastor. 8 months later, I get a phone call from Keith Bottles, the DS. And he says, "Hey, Brian, there's a church in Douglas Park, which is Douglas Park Church in Nazarene, which is on the south side of Danville. Back in the day, Olivet Nazarene University used to be in Olivet, Illinois, down south of Danville. And during those days, those preachers would go out and plant churches. So there was a time when Danville had like 15 to 20 churches that were Nazarene. That was crazy. Well, by the early 90s or late 80s, a lot of those were closing. Well, so Douglas Park was one of them on the south side of Danville. He goes, I've got to close it, but I can't get down there for about a month. Would you be willing to go over and preach 4 Sundays? And I'm like, well, I've never preached before. And my pastor Mike said, well, you pretty much never stop talking, so I think you'll be fine. I think you'll be okay. And so I went over and preached the first Sunday, and preached out of Daniel chapter 1. And I still remember the message, because in the process of preparing for that, I got my call. When I started preparing for that, I'm like, I could spend my life doing this. This is so cool. And everything is a discovery. I mean, it's all new. And I'm just like, this is, I'd heard the story of Daniel my whole life, but I'd never been at it. And in Daniel chapter 1, it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself. And so my message was on that phrase, Daniel resolved. And so I'm preaching to maybe 8 people. I don't know, but I'm going, man. I mean, I am, because I am so, and I'm like, and so I have my Bible, and this is my manual, but pretend it's my Bible. And these days, I'm in the manual every bit as much as I'm in the Bible. So, and I hold my Bible up, and I say, if Daniel had not resolved in chapter 1, There is no story of the lion's den. There is no Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. There's none of that. It's over. And I slammed my Bible shut. And then I realized I have no idea how to find Daniel again. So I begin to leaf through, and I'm leafing through, and I'm looking for my text, and Daniel never, doesn't show up. I have to go to the table of contents. So preached 4 Sundays there, got the call. Dr. Bottles came down, they closed that church. Well, a couple months later, he says, hey, there's a church in Fithian, Illinois that I got to close. And I'm not going to get down there. So I was that guy. If I showed up at your church,
you're not the life giver at this point.
No, I was there. Yeah. So Lindy and I go out, Fithian, a town of 400 people, couple hundred houses, but it was one of the oldest churches on the district. Matter of fact, if you go to the old district directory, there was only one church older than that one, and it was Chicago First.
Oh, wow.
So I go out and we just start preaching, and a month in, people started coming, and then we had friends that would come. There were people who came who were insiders, who loved the Lord. And I know the reason they came is like they came out and they saw what we were doing. They're like, somebody's got to help that boy. So we had some of that help, and it grew. And the DS is like, you had like 40 in church yesterday? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, well, I want to come down, but I don't want to close it. Let's find out what's going on. So that congregation, that group, and there was 5 people that were there when I got there: George and Pat Crawford, Ida Mae Macy, Ethel Weisskopf, and Chris Carlson. They were all over, they may have all been over 80, I don't know, at least over 70. They loved me, and it was undoubtedly the most important church to my ministry that I've pastored.
Wow. Because
they forgave me, they put up with me, because I'm just like, and it was just incredible. And it grew to about 100 before we left. And
wow.
And so then I'm scrambling, I'm going back to trying to figure out how to go back to school and complete the course of study. And yeah, so that's how that was a long answer to your question, but that's how we started.
I had no idea. That is awesome. That's absolutely fantastic. How old were you when you started pastoring that particular church?
So I got saved when I was 28.
Okay.
And I would have been 31.
Okay.
So it was 3 years. I mean, it was, and then I didn't get ordained for another 6 or 7 years. I took a combination of courses from, I ended up completing the course of study, but I was tracking everything, trying to get it done. And yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That is all right. So you are in this 100-member attended church. What's next? What happens next? What's the next?
So we've been there about 4 years, and again, I'm still, I went full time. I think I left. So it was funny because when I called, so the first Sunday I go, there's 5 people left in the church, and the church board secretary is George Crawford. And so the DS says, you got to call George and tell him you're coming, and I'll let him know you're coming. And so, so before our first time, I call him, and he seems it was kind of weird, a weird conversation on the phone. He goes, "No, who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to be the interim. I'm going to preach for a few Sundays until Dr. Bottles can come down and work out with you guys." He's like, "Oh." And I said, he goes, "So what do you do?" I said, "Well, I work for a disposal business." And he's like, "Oh." He goes, "Did you go to college?" I'm like, "No, haven't done that." I said, I got saved. I'm at Southside, and I'm really excited about coming. So I go out there the first Sunday, and there's 5 people there, these 5 I named, and they all sit in the same pew, about the 3rd pew on the right side. And this little church would have seated probably 150, 175, but they're all like, boom, right there.
Yeah.
And I just get up and just go. I mean, I'm Daniel resolved, right? That's the only one I got. And so it's like, here we go. And I get done and I dismiss them. And George says, I want to call a church meeting. And I'm like, I don't think I can do that. And he's like, well, he goes, here's the thing. I'm going to call one. And I don't think the DS is going to have a problem with it, because here's what's gone on. He goes, my wife and I quit. We left this church like 2 months ago. And I told the DS. And so why he told you to call me, I have no idea, because we're gone. But when you called me, you were so excited that I didn't have the heart to tell you that we weren't going to be there. And I figured that if we weren't there, there might not be anybody here. So we came and we're here. But here's the thing. If you'll come back, we'll come back. He said, I think we should do this. That was that first Sunday. And come to find out, there'd been a big church problem a few years earlier, and there was all kinds of dirt. But here's this guy who said, no, we're going to do that. So we went through about 4 years, and it was a blast. I mean, God was moving. I made every mistake you could make. I mean, I did no idea what I was doing, but God blessed it. And we just really kept coming back to, I was dead and now I'm alive. The prodigal son. And so my biggest fear was that I wouldn't get to preach any given week. I was like, someday it's going to be over and I'm not going to get to do this anymore. But after a couple of years, I went full time, and we began to, and then I get a call from Elgin, Illinois, same district. And I said no. They asked me to come interview, and I said no. Well, Jerry Short was a pastor. I had several mentors back then, including Mike Stepp, but Jerry Short was another one. There was an Assembly of God guy who mentored me, who I had come preach before I knew you had to get permission to have somebody from I didn't know any of that, but Jerry called me and said, hey man, you got to go on the interview. I'm like, yeah, but I don't want to go. I mean, these are my people, right? He's like, yeah, but that's not how it works. You don't know what the Lord might be saying. You can say no after you go talk to them. And one of the things that's helped me over the years is that I was so dependent on people, others who could help me, and mentors, that I pretty much did what they told me to do. So if my mentor said you should go, I'm like, oh, I got to go. And coming out of addiction, you've owned everything, and you're at a point where you're like, you've checked the ego, and so it served as an advantage to me in many ways, because I knew I didn't deserve any of this. This was all a gift.
Yeah.
And so God's given me a mentor. And so if he tells you to go, you got to go. And so we went and interviewed, and the Lord spoke. And so we ended up going to Elgin, and Elgin was those were amazing days. The church was, the Lord has put us places where he's moving. And so I've had the benefit of that, and that church grew, and we were there for 3 or 4 years. And then I got a call to Ottawa, Illinois, which is Crossbridge now. And we were there for about 14 years. And that was the church where we raised our kids, and a lot of really cool stuff happened. It was the first place we were involved in planting, and we did a video campus, and we had a blast, man. And we were thinking that probably I'd come to a point where I felt like we might be done at Ottawa. And so the plan was, in 2008, we left there in 2012. In 2008, we did our first video campus, and we kind of stumbled into that. We stumbled into a lot of stuff. I think a lot of it has been because I knew that I knew what I didn't know. I was pretty much really curious. And so we're in we're on the on one side of Ottawa, a little town of 15,000, just west of Chicago, southwest Chicago. And on the other side was this little church, Southside Church, the Nazarene, which was down to about 8 or 10 people. And over the years I was there, for the first 7 or 8 years I was there, we'd kind of become friends with them, and they were solid people, but the church wasn't going anywhere. And a couple of times I said, hey, why don't we could do something together? And they're like, no, God's going to send a revival here. And so the DS kind of made me responsible for finding pastors for them. And we found a couple, and they were there a short time, but it didn't work out. And then we were trying to find interim, and I'd go over there and preach once in a while. Meanwhile, our church is blowing up. I mean, it's amazing. But they were closed one Easter. They called me and said, hey, we're all going to be gone for Easter. We're going to be out of town, so don't worry about sending anybody to preach. I call the DS and I go, if a church is closed on Easter,
yeah,
this might be time, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, well, go talk to him. Good luck with that. So I meet with him, and I said, I start to do a couple of assessment tools that we'd learned, church life cycle, stuff like that. And this lady who was a retired school administrator said, you know what, Pastor Ryan, we don't need to do any of that. I get your point. But I have an idea. And my idea is, if you would just give us a DVD of your message, we could play your message, and that would be something to keep us going until we figure something out. Well, what was interesting about that was that we had just, at Ottawa, the years past, it was like January at that point in time, or maybe earlier in the fall, whatever it was. We were looking at the Easter that was coming up, and we'd always rented the high school auditorium every year, and we couldn't do that this time. And so we were figuring out, okay, if we can't do that, how many services can we have? Can we do like 4 services at our location, and how would we do that? And then she brought up this idea, and I said, so what made you think of that? She goes, well, I went to visit a friend, and I went to her church with her, and when we got there, it was a smaller church. It wasn't huge, but there was, it was 100 people or so, and the music was live, and the pastor got up and welcomed everybody. But then when it came time for the message, a screen came down, and it was a video campus of a larger church. And she goes, I know we can't do all that, but could we just have the DVD? I said, let's try something else. Easter's coming. What if you guys were a video campus for us, with us on Easter? And they're like, yeah, let's do that. Well, now this is what's next is really important, because I remember I told you Danville Southside saved my life, right? And then you had Fithian, this group of folks, small church, who launched me into ministry. Well, now we began to get them ready for Easter. Now, they weren't even worshiping in the sanctuary. They were worshiping in the kitchen area, in this little like fellowship area. And so it looked like somebody walked out of the church in about 1954, left their bulletin on the front pew, right? So I said, look, I want to bring some of my guys over and walk through and do an assessment of what we're going to need to do. So we got over there, and there was walls that would have to be painted. I mean, even if you're going to do it and you're doing it one time, this is what we're thinking, just one time, we're just going to do it for Easter. And, but we know that there might be something else out there if it works, right?
Yeah.
So my board says, we spend a lot on Easter, spend whatever you need to, let's just do this. So I go over and we come up with a checklist of stuff that's got to be done. And we got to bring in video equipment, you know what I mean? And we come up with, I can't remember what the number was. It was over $20,000. And I said, and I was getting ready to tell them, but our board is committed to doing this. When the guy who was in charge of the building is walking me through, and I dropped the $20,000 figure, and he goes, "Oh, we can do that." And I'm like, "You can?" Well, all those years they didn't have a pastor. They were saving a ton of money, so they had money. And it's like, boom, we put a new roof on the church 2 years ago. We're good. And I'm like, are you kidding? I said, now you realize this may be one day. Yeah. And he's like, yeah, it's okay. Because what else are we going to do? And I'm like, okay. And there was a really critical moment when we were in the sanctuary, and right behind the pulpit, there was a beautiful wooden cross. Somebody had it made. I mean, it was just gorgeous. And I'm walking in there with my video guy, and I said, so where are we going to put a screen? And he goes, you don't want to know the answer to that. He goes, where it needs to go is center, right where that cross is. But I'm not even going to begin to mess with that, right? So while we're talking, the guy who had walked through the building with me, Jerry, he comes up and he goes, what are you guys talking about? I said, well, we're trying to figure out where to put the video screen. He goes, well, where's the best place for it? And I said, well, we think we can put a couple on each side, that would be smaller. He goes, yeah, but where's the best place for it? I'm like, well, to be honest with you, it's there, but we're not going to do that. He goes, excuse me. So he leaves the room. 4 or 5 minutes later, he comes back with a ladder. He gets up, he takes the cross down. And he said, my grandfather or my uncle or my somebody is who donated this. They would not want it to be in the way of what we're trying to do. We'll hang it in the back.
Good Lord, man.
So we had a couple hundred, 250, I think 250 is what we had at that location on that Easter.
Wow.
And they hadn't been open for 5 years. And after I left, they ended up bringing all together, and they moved the video campus to another town and everything. But yeah, I mean, it was just, so when I look back, I've pastored, Chicago First was a big church. Ottawa became a big church, but it was a church of a couple hundred when we went there. So which is big. As a DS now, I realize how big that is. But it's bigger. And I'm grateful for those churches. I'm grateful for the impact they can have. I'm grateful for that. But when I look at my journey, I go back to Danville Southside. I go back to Fithian, right? And I even thinking about that Southside church, which is why I'm so committed. But here's the call that I had coming out of that Easter. I felt like the Lord said, Brian, I want you to leverage the resources of a larger church with the personality, proximity of the small church to develop the church where it's needed most, which is right down the block.
That's good. And so that was at Ottawa?
Yeah. And through that Easter, when I got done with that Easter thing, it was like, well, what? And then I began to think about rural America. Mm-hmm. And there are towns out there, 4,000 or 5,000, that at one point in time had 4 churches or 5 churches, and now don't have any. Mm-hmm. And I'm not anti-mega church. I'm not anti-big church. I'm a fan. Let's do it. But the truth is, there's some people we're never going to get there. Mm-hmm. What if we could develop a network of healthy, smaller congregations in these locations, but they're networked, so there's an excellence quality, you know what I mean? There's all of those things that are coming. So that's what I thought I was going to do, and do that in rural America. And then I went to Chicago First.
Well, before we get to First Church, what were some of the lessons that you learned though in Ottawa as you're seeing this? You're being a part of a church that's grown from a couple hundred to what, like 900, something like that?
1,000, yeah.
1,000.
Yeah, so I learned, that's where I met Dr. Crawford Howe, the district superintendent, who taught me leadership.
Okay.
And when I say, I mean, Crawford was a hands-on leadership developer. And the first conversation that we had after I got to Ottawa, well, he had told me in the beginning so my wife and I are in Elgin, and we go on vacation to Florida. We come back, and back in those days we had answering machines right at the house, and there was a voicemail on there, and it said, Reverend Wangler, my name is Crawford Howe, Dr. Crawford Howe. I'm the DS on Northwest Illinois, and I have a rather romantic assignment to talk to you about. And so my wife and I are listening to this message, and she's going, what the heck is that? I go, I think he's calling us to pastor a church where we're probably going to die when it's over. That's the kind of story. So, but in my first conversation, he goes, Ottawa's a healthy church, and it was church of a couple hundred. He said, has great potential, and I think you're the guy to lead it. But if you come, I need you as a leader. And if you let me, I'll develop you as a leader. But if you don't want the leadership development, please don't come to the church.
That's good.
And I was hungry. Again, I go back to, I'm just an addict who was hanging on the back of a garbage truck, right? Who got a call. And so, yeah, talk to me. And he began coaching me on everything. Body language. I mean, the leadership lessons are, he was principle driven. So he would say, Brian, here's a principle I want to talk to you about. Today, when you were doing this, I heard you say, why do you think you said that? I mean, early on, it was tough because it felt like every time I turned around, he was like, can I talk to you for a second? I'm like, oh, crap. Here we go again. But he really did form me into issues of leaders own the problem. I couldn't call Crawford up and go, the people, you didn't do that with him. He would say something like, wow, that's tough. Those people are not really following, are they? Whose job is it to lead them? Right. And so that was the core, that was the most important thing that happened at Ottawa. I learned a lot. His battle cry was lost people matter to God. And so that's why we're here. And that's what we're going to do. And so I learned about how important church culture was, because for a church to decide that they're going to give themselves to reaching lost people, outsiders, they have to be willing to die. And I watched a group of people do that. There were times when I would cast vision, and my leadership pattern, and I didn't set out to do this, it just kind of developed. About every 18 to 24, sometimes 36 months at a time, I would come to the church and go, hey, here's where I think we need to go next. Here's what I think we need to be doing. It's what I refer to now when we teach is, this is the mission of the moment. So churches have mission, right? Mission, vision. The problem is that sometimes we have a mission statement, but we never have a mission of the moment. That's and it's good. Hard to execute a grand mission. If the mission's the world to Jesus, it's like, okay, what do we do now, right? And so if you break down, so we know that over the next 60 to 90 or however long, this is what we're going to be working on, because that 18 to 24 months would be broken down to maybe 3 to 6 month commitment. Here's what we need to do. Here's what we need to do. So you're moving, you're growing like this. You don't grow like this. You're tackling one issue at a time. And sometimes you get stuck.
Yeah.
And when you're stuck, you stay stuck until you figure out what's going to let you begin to go forward. And the Lord's working. So the leadership component was the most important, because he worked on me. He taught me, Lencioni talks about perfect team players as being humble, hungry, and smart.
Yeah.
And that was Crawford. I don't know that he ever used that language, but for him, and so he just would pound that into us as leaders. And I could tell you, I got more stories than you would even begin to have time on him addressing that and teaching that. And then to learn that really, as a leader, I have to think of the journey as a pathway. So if we want to impact our community, we're not going to be able to say, okay, let's impact our community, and now we're going to do an event. Event is going to impact our community. Well, that event may be one step along the pathway. It's extremely relational. There is no evangelism at the end. There's very little evangelism. There is no, who am I to say that? I don't know. But evangelism that we've experienced has been the most fruitful when it was looked at as a pathway. So one of the paradigms that we developed was, if you take an arrow that's arching up, and in the center of that you have like 0, and then going up you go +1, +2, +3, and then going down you go -1, -2, -3. We created that and said, okay, that's a spiritual spectrum. Mm-hmm. 0 is the born again point. That's where somebody gives their life to Christ. Right. All of us are somewhere on this spectrum. Some people are plus whatever, and other people are minus. I mean, I was like a -124 right in the beginning. We decided that our goal with everything that we did, particularly our gathering, was that we wanted everybody to move at least one step. So if a -10 became a -9, that's a win for us. And we didn't want to let a +9 stay there. You got to keep going, because it's not a perfect line, number one, right? Life doesn't work that way. The line is more like this, right? And it's relational in terms of our relationship with God. So how can we help a +1 to become a +2 and a +4? And the truth is, we can't, but we can create environments where that can happen. How does a +1 become a +2? Well, what's the environment for that? Well, there's discipling, there's some accountability, there's community involved. We can't help a +1 become a +2, but we can work on developing discipling and community. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Try to create the environment where God does his work. Can't do the work.
Yeah.
We can create the environment where, not a perfect analogy, but one that was helpful, because we did stuff that we would have events that didn't have any gospel in them at all in terms of us preaching or teaching. And the one who had the most trouble with that was me, because I was like, let's get a crowd together and give away something or tell them something, and then I'll hit them with the gospel, right? And we'll, boom. And so I had to grow out of that and realize that sometimes we just need to be with people and get to know them, and without the church doing anything that technically could be considered preaching. There were men or guys or women who went home and went, you know what? I don't know if I agree with that church. I don't know if I agree with everything they teach, but I'm going to go back.
So when it comes to, you walk into Ottawa, it's like 200 people or so, and then they grow. There's a catalytic moment, I would assume, and or moments like what you've talked about, where that congregation has to choose to want to be. Yep. I don't necessarily think they need to necessarily say we want to be a larger church, but we want to make the most impact, right?
Yep. There was a moment.
What was the moment?
So Willow used to run Acts chapter. Now we're going back to the early 90s, probably before you were born. All right.
I was born in 87. So okay. I do know a little bit. I'm a 90s kid.
No. He used to run Acts, Hybels used to run Acts chapter 2 conferences. Okay. And for 2 or 3 days, he would bring in people who were getting significant fruit in ministry, but each of these looked different. They were all different. And he would bring in Cowboy Church. He would bring in all kinds of, and for a period of 2 or 3 days or 4 days. And I had 2 laymen, Dave Alderson being one of them at the time, who's now an ordained elder, and then Mark Buell, who was a kind of a catalytic leader. And they had read something and they said, hey, you want to go to this conference? I'm like, I wasn't a conference guy then. I'm like, I don't want to go. Well, they went, and they come home, and they had heard Andy Stanley present North Point's paradigm at that time, which was twofold. Number one, we want to build a church that unchurched people want to come to. Mm-hmm. And so it's a radical shift. And their approach to ministry was not children's ministry, but family ministry. It was radical. And they come back and they give me the book that Stanley had written, or Joyner had written, Reggie Joyner at the time. And they kind of throw it in front of me and they're like, this is who we should be. And I'm like, so I read the book and I'm like, okay. So I begin to, well, this would mean a shift in our mentality. Now, we'd already been talking about lost people, right, for years. And we've seen lost people come and we developed different things. But this was a point where if we're going to do this, it's going to change the way we do children's ministries, because we're not going to have every Sunday is going to be Bible school. Yeah. Every Sunday is going to be mom and dad together. And if you do that, you can't do the other stuff. You won't have resources to do. So there's a major shift. We need people to serve on Sunday instead of study. So we're going to move from what would be the old school Sunday school to doing life groups, a different time. We're going to move away from a Sunday night service so that we can have small group time. We're not going to have a Wednesday night service because we're getting ready for there was about 10 changes that, and both of these leaders who were business people said, I said, well, could we be part of it? They're like, nope, that's not how it's going to work. It won't work. We won't do it because it's a mindset.
Yeah.
So at that point in time, North Point Church, which is where Andy and Reggie were, used to host a weekend at North Point thing that you could go. So we took about 17 church leaders. We went down to Atlanta and we came in on Friday and we spent the weekend with them. We came back and I put a proposal together and talked to DS, called the DS, and he's like, man, this is a big deal. And I go, yeah. Now I'd been there 4 or 5 years, right? And so we'd seen some movement. So I had some leadership equity to work with. Mm-hmm. But I was pretty much going all in. I mean, you make those. So, but we voted to do it. And so we began to use Sunday nights. We took about 3 or 4 months to talk. We had a senior adult luncheon every month. And I would go in and I would say, here's what we're thinking. And here's why we're thinking it. We want to reach these families and we're not reaching them. And here's some new ideas that we're thinking. And people were, they were awesome. And we talked and people pushed back. And so we started Sunday nights, our Sunday night services throughout the summer all became, okay, this week I want you to go your unchurched kids. I want you to ask them this question. The people you work with who don't go to church, I want you to ask them this question. And folks would come back with the answers. And when they began to engage outsiders with questions, we didn't say, we want you to go invite your kids. No, don't do that yet. We're not ready. And first of all, you've done it for 20 years and they're not here. So hold on. So we would pray. We would use that time to pray. And we would use that time to talk. And it just was about 3 or 4. The Sunday nights got so good that when we came down because we launched in September, when we came down to the end of August, the folks said, hey, Pastor Brian, we're in. We're good. This is a good thing to do. But man, we don't want to lose Sunday nights. It is so helpful to us. And I remember saying from the pulpit on a Sunday night, and our attendance was way up on Sunday night, but it was an insider thing.
Yeah.
And I said, we're not going to continue Sunday nights. And here's the reason, because I'm afraid that you'll be here. And they're like, wait, what? I said, and this isn't where we need you. We need you at the kitchen table telling your story to somebody else. And now through this, there was pushback. I don't remember most of it. I do remember there was a letter that was sent to all the board about me during it, so I remember something that was painful. I mean, it's not that this was without pain. It was, but I had a great DS. who was teaching me about leadership. And so you didn't call Crawford Howe and go, somebody talked bad about me. He'd be like, well, of course they did. And then he'd be like, was it true? And I'm like, well, sometimes. So you had these different things happening. The leader, and I can remember him saying this to me one day. Brian, we'd grown the church to 300 at that point or whatever. He goes, Brian, Ottawa has to have a different leader to grow this church to 500. It can either be you, and you can take the next step in your journey, or I can go find somebody else. I'd really rather it be you. And now as a DS, I know he was pretty much bluffing, but nevertheless, so there was this continual, and I mean, so it was a combination of these things where all I brought to the table, the only thing I brought to the table of any real value, and I am not blowing smoke with this, was a humble spirit that said, teach me. And the humility to say when something didn't go right, hey guys, years ago, do you know the Andy Griffith Show? Are you familiar with the Andy Griffith Show?
Uh-huh.
So in the early 90s, somebody came out with a Bible study that was based off of the Andy Griffith Show. And there'd be a short video clip of an episode.
Yeah.
And then it would, well, we did it one summer back in those early days. So on Wednesday nights, we had this thing where, we'd have some decorations up and we'd have stuff for the kids and we'd give away a Barney badge or, you know what I mean? And we would use that. We'd show a video clip and we'd do a thing. And it was a blast. I mean, it was fun and it was different. And so in the middle of that, the guy who was my Sunday school superintendent who had proposed it came and said, hey, I found another one of these Bible studies. And I'm like, cool, let's do that next summer. I'm like, well, what is it? And are you familiar with the show, The Beverly Hillbillies?
Oh, my word. Yes.
Yeah, I wish you'd have been there.
Yeah, right.
I heard the idea and I went, that's awesome. That's a good show. And by comparison to what's on TV, it's clean.
Oh, yeah.
But if you go back, we discovered real quick once we started it. So we launched it on a Sunday morning. Hey, this is what we're doing this Wednesday night. Well, Granny's drunk about half the time. Jethro's out chasing women, right? And Ellie Mae's, walking around in a, bathing suit or whatever. And there's all these innuendos. So about maybe 3 weeks in, I stood up on a Sunday morning and I said, folks, we've been doing the Beverly Hillbillies Bible study. When you say it out loud, you realize how ridiculous it is.
Right.
Beverly Hillbillies Bible study. And I said, this is not working out. I said, and so I want to apologize to you. I hadn't really thought this through, but we are canceling the Beverly Hillbillies Bible study. And I got an ovation from the audience. And they were laughing and they were clapping. I'm going, this is just a good example. We're going to try a lot of stuff around here. And this one didn't work, right? So that was one moment that's easy to talk about, but there were others. There were moments when I dropped the ball, mistakes that I made because I couldn't contain the schedule. And so I would sometimes promise things I didn't deliver, you know what I mean? There was a lot of learning that came through that. But if I go back to a moment, it was that summer, that moment over the Acts 2 thing, and we launched it. And it's interesting because when we went for that weekend at North Point, that ended on Monday morning, where you got to meet with a staff member before you headed out. Well, Reggie Joyner was a staff member we met with.
Wow.
And Reggie created the Orange Curriculum since and has done a ton of stuff. Well, he was a staff member then. Well, there was probably 50, 75 people in the room as we're doing our exit interview with him. And one of my folks says, hey, we're from a church that's like 80 years old, 85 years old, and we're transitioning to the North Point model. And so I have a question. And he went, wait, whoa. He goes, you're what? he said, "Are you an independent church?" He said, "No, we're part of the Nazarene denomination." He goes, "Oh, I love Nazarenes, but an 80-plus-year-old church, does your pastor know you're here?"
Yeah.
He was joking. And then they pointed at me and he said, "Are you crazy?" He said, "Normally you can't transition a church like this." And I said, "Well, we're going to try." He goes, "Well, good luck. And if it works, let me know about it."
Oh.
So it worked and we grew, and starting in I sent my first email to him. We launched that in 2004-ish. I sent my first email to him about 9 or 10, probably 2009 or 10, said, "Hey, remember you said," and I never got anything back. 2015, I'm at Chicago First, and my children's pastor, Evan Offit, was going to the Orange Conference. And I made a comment as she left staff meeting. I go, "Hey, if you see Joyner, tell him he owes me a phone call." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Because," he said, "well, she comes home with his private email." And she goes, "I went and talked to him and he said for you to email him." So I emailed him and said, "Hey, Reggie, you're not going to remember me, but blah, 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 blah." I never got a response, except I got a response from Carrie Newhoff.
Whoa, that'll do.
Yeah. So Carrie sends me an email and he goes, "Hey, my friend Reggie Joyner sent me your story and I have a podcast and I'd like to interview you on my podcast. And I want to hear the story."
Oh, wow.
So I don't know what the podcast number is, but that was my 15 minutes of fame right there.
You're on the Carrie Newhoff podcast?
Yeah. If you Google Brian
awesome.
Wangler and Carrie Newhoff, you'll find the podcast. And he talked to me. So I thought we were going to talk about the whole Ottawa experience, but most of what he wanted to talk about that day was that first Fithian experience. Mm-hmm. So I got to do that. So it was fun.
That's fantastic.
So technically, Reggie Joyner still owes me a phone call.
If somehow you listen to this, Pastor Reggie, here it is.
Yeah, I'm not bitter. But if you keep sending me that kind of stuff, I probably won't be bitter.
That's fantastic.
But yeah.
Wow, there's so many questions. Oh my gosh, I wish we had like 3 hours. All right, so from there you get the call to First Church, First Naz.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. That's a big deal.
Yeah. There were folks from Chicago First who would spend some weekends in Ottawa, because Ottawa, Illinois is kind of a little getaway from Chicago, and they would wind up at the church. And there was a staff member, Clark Howe was a worship pastor, and that was Dr. Howe's son. And so Clark had really been helpful to us, helping us create worship planning systems and stuff like that. And so they're open, and we get a call to interview. And my first thing is, I don't think so. Because I'm not urban, and technically First Naz isn't either. They're in, but I'm not really suburban. I mean, it's a different. And we really weren't thinking going north. We were hoping to move south or something like that. I knew that a move was probably coming. And then they asked me to interview again, and it's like, if a Chicago First calls twice, you probably ought to take a look at it. I mean, it's one of the mother churches of our denomination.
Yeah.
I mean, and so we go for an interview, and I walked into the board, and I could tell real quick that there were board members who were, because our reputation had been that we're principle driven, meaning that we'll learn from anybody, and we think data matters, and we think demographics matter, and there's business principles that we can use that will help us, but we're also spirit-led. So we're not the kind that are just going to wait on God to come in and do something. At the same point in time, we're going to identify principles, but we may violate them because we're spirit-led. Well, there were business folks who loved that idea. There were other folks who are like terrified of that idea. And in the interview, it kind of became obvious about that. And Chicago First was the first church that we went to that didn't really need us. Mm. They were Chicago First, right? And so there wasn't this. So after the first interview, the district superintendent calls me and he says, well, they want to pray about it and think it over, and maybe we'll give you a word in a couple of weeks. And I'm thinking, well, that's generally is not good, right? And when you're considering an interview somewhere, your life's kind of upside down for a while because you may move. And calls in a couple of weeks, said they want another interview because half the people would really love for you to come, and the other half are wondering how many dead bodies will be in the wake.
Oh my gosh!
And I said, well, that's probably all we need to know. I don't think, you know what I mean? I think we're out.
Yeah.
And so, okay. So, well, then we go 3 more months, during which I did the skydive. And they call again. And so for some reason, I interpreted that as God really trying to get our attention. What was happening was people were saying no. no. Let's go back to Wangler. That's not totally true. It certainly was a mixture. And so we went to interview. This time, the executive pastor then was Andy Combs. And Andy said, the first time you came to interview, you didn't go see our site, the site on the west side of Chicago in the Austin neighborhood, where we're partnering with an after-school program. And this time you have to go. You have to go see that. So we did. We went to Austin, and I'd not spent any. If I wound up in the inner city, I was lost and terrified. And so we're driving in this neighborhood, and I'm like, wow, this is incredible. And just the makeshift memorials that were alongside the road, and just the devastation, And then we pull into this church, and I walk into this building, and I'm swarmed by 200 kids who are in this after-school program. And this after-school program would start at kindergarten and see them through college.
Really?
Oh, yeah. By the Hand is the name of the program. It was just still the most incredible ministry that I've ever been a part of. And these kids are there, and we're swarmed, and Andy's like, you can leverage what's happening in the suburbs ministry. And it goes back to the calling. Brian, I want you to leverage the resources of a large church with the personality and proximity of the small church to develop the church where it's needed most, right down the block. When we left, Lindy was crying, and I said, why are you crying? And she goes, because it's over. And I said, yeah, I think it is. The opportunity to be part of that. So we said yes, and we ended up going through a pretty significant revisioning, refocusing process at the church, which was painful. If you amplified all the other shifts, we did a refocus process that was about 18 months long. And there was 3 months when the refocus team met every Wednesday night for about 2.5 hours. We did everything we could do. We got a coach, we did that. And then the culture began to shift. And I say this, I love Chicago First, and I love the people who were there when I left, and the people who left because I was there. Okay.
Yeah.
Because not everybody wanted to go on the journey. But the staff referred to in the beginning, it was kind of a Christian country club. That was the feel. And so to turn that now into something that's going to be intentional, not just about reaching the nuns, NONES, right around them, much less reaching into the city. And the previous pastor, Kevin Lemont, had started that ministry in the city. So he had a vision for it, for sure. We didn't start that. And so it took about 4.5 years for the culture to shift and for us to find our footing. And then we began to develop ministries outside. And then what came out of that was the freedom to begin to do stuff like we did with Galen and with Oak Lawn and that kind of stuff.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about Galen, let's talk about Oak Lawn.
Yeah. So here's what happened. 2016, I read the book Canoeing the Mountains.
Yeah.
By Todd Bolsinger.
Great book.
Yeah. And I suddenly realized that what we were struggling with, because what I was seeing was stuff that first 20 years wouldn't work. It was not the same anymore. There were shifts. And one of the major shifts that I encountered in ministry was the first 20 years I was in ministry, I could count on my core people. They were going to be there 48, 49 times a year. Mm-hmm. I mean, they might take a couple week vacation, but boom, they're insured. Well, that all began to shift in the 2000, even at Ottawa, it had begun to shift in 2010 and 2012. And in Chicago, our folks had lake houses. Mm. And younger families were involved in sports at a level that I'd never seen before.
Wow.
Where, club, everything, right? Mm-hmm. Travel team, everything. And so if your model for reaching lost people is the gathering, and you're not gathering anymore, because if those folks don't know if they're going to be here, they don't invite. Yeah. And they don't serve. And so I was at a point where at first I thought it was just me. I thought, well, I'm not the guy. I came to do a job and I've done my job and now I need to let somebody else in. But then when I read the book and I realized, wait a minute, what we're experiencing, the country is experiencing in this move away. So I went, and so I began to look Chicago first. So, you start out with, okay, what do we have, right? What do you have in your hand? God asked Moses. We had a recreation program that was incredible, but we weren't reaching those rec families. And neither had the churches over the last 40 years to any degree. Got there, Pastor Andy, the executive pastor, said the people who are here during the week for our recreation program have no idea what happens on the weekend. And the people who are here on the weekend have no idea what happens in recreation. And we've tried a ton of stuff to try to, and so I had thought, those are young families. And at that point in time, I went to the board and I said, okay, I think I'm done. I think in terms of what I can do, if I was going to preach us to a new day, I think it would have happened by now. And we saw fruit, and we were doing ministries in different places. And it's not like God wasn't moving. As a matter of fact, we were seeing more first-time people come to faith than the church had seen, but the overall numbers weren't there. And it was just like, something's not right. It just didn't feel right. So I think I'm done. But I got an idea. And if you'd be willing to try the idea, I'd love to stay. Like, well, what's your idea? And the idea was, I'd like to bring in a younger face who could connect more quickly with these families. And I'd like for that person to begin to do at least half of the preaching, probably end up doing 3/4 of the preaching. And that's going to free me up to work on some things that have been Post-it notes on the wall that I've never got to. For instance, several years earlier, there was a church named Kathy Powell, and that we had a Celebrate Recovery, and it went down. And Celebrate Recoveries can be kind of seasonal. I'm learning that it's really hard to hold that for a long time, right? Because that, ours was in a down. And she had come to me and said that, Pastor Brian, I feel like God wants me to take Celebrate Recovery into the local treatment center. And there was a nationally known local women's treatment center that's right outside of Lemont. I'm not going to. And she said, I have 2 questions. Number 1, do you think they'll let me? Number 2, do you think I can do it? And I love Kathy. Up to that point in time, I didn't know anything about Kathy's leadership, and so I didn't know if she could or she couldn't. And I was pretty sure they wouldn't let her. But as a pastor, I've learned it's not my job to answer those questions. Right. It's my job to say, Kathy, I don't know what they'll let you do, but if God's called you to do something, you need to go see if it'll open up. And I promise you, if it does, we're going to help. Okay. Well, she comes back and goes, and this was a new age place. I mean, it's just not, if you would drive by or you would come in, you'd be like, but because they were new age, they were open spiritually. Yeah. So it's like, so she went in and she began to, and she would tell me, hey, Wednesday night we had this many people, and she would tell me about conversation. Hey, Kathy, that's awesome. And meanwhile, my head was down in the stuff, right? Yeah. So I leave a conference at Naperville Community Christian, Exponential. They had an Exponential one day or something. And my phone rings and she says, hey, Pastor, it's been a year. I felt like I needed to give you a report of what we're doing. In my head's, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. And she said, so she told me some stuff and numbers I don't remember. And then she goes, but we've prayed with 167 women to receive Christ. I said, Kathy, that's amazing. So we hang up and I'm going, wait, I call her back. Did you say how many? She said 167. Well, I'd just done my annual report and we had like 40. And I'm like, so Kathy, are these women who just raised their hand? Are you talking about somebody raised their hand? She went, Pastor, that's not how you lead somebody to Christ. I said, she goes, these are women whose hands I held. And I led them down. I think it was the Romans Road was her particular tool. She goes, they prayed, we prayed. And then I would connect them to a Celebrate Recovery or a church where they came from. Oh, man. And then I would follow up. Some of them I'm discipling online. Wow. And I had years ago, I wrote a devotional called God Time, Your First 31 Days. And so Kathy was giving them away. And every once in a while, I'd get a check in the mail from someplace in the United States. And somebody would say, here's $100. That book really helped me. Would you use it for that? Well, so I began to put all that together. And I'm like, Kathy, this is incredible. So I went to my church board. Again, this is one of the things that I'd never gotten around to because I was doing all this other stuff, preaching. And I said, we either need to figure out how to reach lost people or close down and give Kathy Powell the money. So we searched around. Galen came, and we just had, and it was scary for me. I know it was scary for him because I'm relatively sure. You have to have him tell you this story. I don't know what people told him, but I'm relatively sure that there were a significant number of people who said, Wangler's never going to give you the pulpit that much. He may intend to, but you're going to get there. And so, because that's what people told me. They said, you're not going to do it. But because I love preaching. And to be honest, through all of these years of ministry, when everything else outside of the pulpit was kind of crud, when it wasn't working, when we were battling, you can get up there and preach and feel like, right? Yeah. Well, now you're giving that up. And so, but he came in, the Lord sent him to us. He is like, and Dr. McCain had told me, if this don't go well, you're probably, yeah, I know. I get it. You're not. Because there's so many things that could go wrong. I mean, I technically, I was still a senior pastor, but I laid that aside and said, if I have to get that out, something's went horribly wrong. So we created an executive team of Pastor Galen. So now you've got this young man who has an equal voice at the table to mine. And then our executive pastor, Phil Kazee, who I released all the finances to and everything. And we would meet every Wednesday morning. And Galen Ryman and Phil Kazee are just two of the most, and I've had more fun. I had more fun in those last 3.5 or 4 years during COVID, through COVID. We had momentum coming out of COVID. I could tell you story after story of how God used Galen. And then I was able to go and spend some time with in the ministries that we were doing in Chicago and coaching and trying to help like the CR thing. And because the question becomes, if that could happen out there, if there's 167, where else could we be? Mm-hmm. The issue, because at the end of the day, when I left, we celebrated Kathy the year or so before I left. And there's only 2 states in the union that she hasn't sent women back to.
Really?
What are we missing?
Yeah.
Well, right. This comes in a line, and I spent time with a YMCA executive the other day, and there is a ministry. God is moving into YMCA. They want churches in every one of their locations.
Really?
and they'll rent you space. If you want to plant a church, come in and then go off. But that's not what they really want. They want you to be there. Nice. And they want you to be a chaplain during the week to their staff. It's crazy. I heard this executive and I'm like, how did I not know this was going on? I mean, there's like 2,600 YMCAs or something like that. I mean, it's crazy. So anyway, so while Galen was preaching, then I was able to do, and we helped relaunch Oaklawn, which is now Ridgeland Church of the Nazarene. And so, so it just came out. I kind of figured I knew that that as sweet as everything was that we were doing, that probably it couldn't last forever. One of the things I found out is that when you hit a really sweet spot in ministry, it's about to blow up. And I've been moments when I would look at it and I go, man, this staff is amazing, which usually meant somebody's going to come and go, Pastor Brown, I got an opportunity. Yep. And we embraced that, by the way. We really did. I asked staff, I said, promise me 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
And I told our board, we're going to get used to that. And it's a little tough, but we're the mother church. We should be doing that.
Yeah.
So we're going to develop and send out. So I had reached a point, and the Indianapolis thing came up very, very quick. I had gotten some calls over the years, I'd gotten calls from DSs asking, hey, would you talk to this pastor? Would you work with this? So I'd done some of that. I thought I might go do that just on my own.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I was headed before we got the call to come here. So, yeah.
So you're in the Indianapolis district.
Yep.
A new role. I'm sure it's exciting and scary. And
we've got urban, suburban, and rural.
Okay. Wow.
So we've got 3 of those environments, and rural is what there's a lot going on on the urban side, and we're involved in that and excited about that. But the rural is really interesting. I'm learning. Yeah.
So, oh man, there's so many questions. The thing that pops out in my head is, during the time of working with younger leaders and being a church that's comfortable with letting certain things go.
Yeah.
What are some of the major lessons that you learned in the midst of sharing pulpit and then working with younger leaders that maybe other pastors could learn from?
First of all, we need to stop thinking. We need to let me rephrase that. I'm talking about what we, the Holy Spirit spanked me bad over my attitude towards the next generation leader. They're there.
Yeah.
We've got to find and develop them. And we can have a tendency to become critical, and we can have a tendency because it is different, right? I mean, all the jokes about millennials, I'm in for that. I think it's hilarious. and many of them are true. But when I met Galen Ryman, you're not going to outwork Galen. That was one of the first things I knew about him. You can't outwork him. He'll be there before you. He'll stay there. And there's a whole host of leaders like that. Now, many of them are not responding to our call because what we're doing is not what they want to do. Mm. They want to reach people in a different spot, in a different way, in a different level, and all of that. So I had to learn. And one of the biggest lessons was that in ministry early on, I would have a hole I needed to fill or a role I needed somebody to play. And I would go interview you and I would say, hey, I think you should come be this for us. Can you do that? And then I would do everything I could to help you understand that you need, and I never did understand why anybody wouldn't come. I mean, who does not want to be part of what we're doing, right? And over the years, I realized that the more effective way for me was, Eric, who are you? What's God put in your heart to do? We want to help you do that. Mm. So now I'm not putting you into a role. I'm telling you that we as a church and a church board want to help you live out your calling. And if that's students, go. If that's something that we haven't done before, which I hope it is, because we're pretty good at doing what we do. It doesn't get great results, but we know how to do that. And so my mindset shifted through the years from trying to find another Brian Wangler to trying to find an individual who had a calling and something that God had put in their heart, and saying, okay, I'm going to call you out, because we'll help you go do that. And so go, another thing I learned was, I had heard this early on and I didn't believe it, that from a standpoint of resources, financial resources specifically, the issue is never money. The issue is mission and vision. And I can remember hearing people say that early on and going, it's easy to say if you got money, right? But I have seen that principle played out over and over and over and over again. The leader has to take ownership. That's another major thing I've learned, is that if there's, in working with young leaders, that's one of the things we taught. So Jocko Willink, former Navy SEAL's got a book called Extreme Ownership.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it's brutal, because if you're the leader, it is on you. So we would tell our staff, don't come to staff meeting and go, yeah, there's no one to do it.
Oh, right.
That's your job,
Yeah.
right? That's your calling. That's the reason you're here. If all these positions were filled, we wouldn't need you, right? And I was only able to teach that because I lived it.
Right.
And so I had to get to a point where I went, no, so I think that the next generation of leaders, and working with young leaders, means that more than anything else, we have to stay at the table. And there's, everything from all the social justice stuff that sometimes the church can wrestle with. One of the things I appreciated about our young staff at Chicago First, and it wasn't just Galen. I talk about Galen a lot, but Adam and Ethan and Hunter and the staff we've had there, Matthew and others, was that we have to stay at the table and keep talking. And you have to give the Holy Spirit time. So leadership is discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to, as a pastor, not, because in the early days, the pastor, this is how we do things, and this is what we do, and this is what and when I began to see myself as developing leaders instead of using leaders, and developing staff instead of hiring or firing staff. And sometimes you have to do that. I mean, there's times you got to redeploy. That happens. But more than anything else, I began to see the calling. So I think the lessons I've learned is we need to repent for the way that we've talked about the generation that's coming up. They got some repenting to do too. I wish Galen was on this. Because I'd go, yeah, but that's not ownership. That's not our problem. Our problem's us, right? Yeah. And then I think we need to be committed to helping people hear the call and follow the call of God.
That's awesome.
Just give ourselves to that. I'm going to try something next year at senior high camp here. So I got here, and like the same week or the next week, I find out senior camp's going on. I'm going, I haven't gone to senior high camp in forever. I think DSs are supposed to show up, or like walk across the grounds or something, right? You got to make. So I just show up, and I drove home, and I thought, what if with these junior and senior high kids, because I think they were together. I don't know that for sure, but what if we were able to say, if I was able to say to them on the opening night, hey, you guys don't know me. My name is Brian. Part of what my job is to help you follow your dream. I'm going to be here this week. And if God puts something in your heart to do, whatever it is, I would love to hear about it. And I'm going to be buying ice cream over here, doing something. And then I wonder if we could have leadership there during that week. And we begin to have junior high kids come up and go, hey, I feel like God's called me to, and vocational ministry is fine, but it's not even about that for me right now. It's these young people have a calling, and they don't know what it is yet, but they're beginning. And how many testimonies do we have from camps, right?
Oh yeah.
Kids. So it's like, we just want to nurture that. And then I want to come back and go, hey, Eric, I saw you last year. You wanted to be a firefighter or whatever. What are you thinking now? I was like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. What if we could build a relationship? Because the pipeline, the leadership pipeline that we need is not out there. It's right in here.
Nice.
And so we want to develop those leaders, and we want to connect with them younger and begin to say, and what is it that makes you angry?
Yeah.
What are you angry about? What do you want? If you could change that, I want to create environments where we can get them to begin to talk to us about that. And then bring the church together and say, hey, I don't care if it's an engineering student. I don't care what that God's called them to do. Our role is to help them go do it.
Whew. Yeah.
You've heard a lot of what I want to do. I haven't done any of that yet.
That's fine. I'll pray you into that. That's really,
yeah.
I think that's where, and I'm 35. I've been only a part of this denomination now for about 5 years or so. But I've been in ministry for 10 plus years. And I think a real shift is exactly what you're talking about. We have to be the Holy Spirit's already working in people, and we've created all these different, honestly, roadblocks and barriers saying, no, it's got to look like this, got to feel like this, got to be like this. Yeah. It's like that's why this is the Everywhere podcast. God's already working in and through people everywhere. We just got to say, all right, Spirit, like the book of Acts, right? I'm just going to partner with the Spirit and help people live in their calling and their dreams. Here
would be my challenge, and I've talked too much, but Donald Miller helped me with Story Brand.
Did he? Okay.
So this is 5 years ago, and this is when we were having staff, and I would pour my heart into staff. Brady Thielander came and was our worship pastor, and from the time Brady's just this great guy, and we have him for 3 or 4 years, and he takes a senior pastorate. And it's good, but I was like, oh, and then I began to realize, no, that's what we do, right?
There you go.
And my son said, well, you need to read Donald Miller and Story Brand. And so, and Miller's latest book is called Hero on a Mission.
Fantastic book.
Have you read the book? So
I love it.
So here's how I view how I want to spend the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Every story, there's a character. And the character is this individual who emerges, and they're kind of rough around the edges, but they're likable, and this character is going to become a hero. And somewhere early on, this character gets a calling. There's a wrong that any movie, there's a wrong that needs to be righted. There's something that needs to be done, and no one else is doing it, and this character sets out to do it. And this character has a certain amount of giftedness that enables them to have some early success. Yeah, Rocky's going to go, right? Or whatever the story, we're going to go. And somebody goes off to school, right, to prepare for ministry, or they're accepting a calling, or making hard choices. And their passion and their calling carry them. But then in every story, the character hits a wall. And sometimes it's an inside thing. Sometimes it's an outside thing. But whatever it is, it stops them. And at that point in time, one of a couple things will happen to that character. They will either never be able to get up from it. And it may happen when they're 15, or it may happen when they're 50. But this thing has happened. And it may be their fault, or somebody else's, or some combination, which is generally the case. If that character doesn't get up and become the hero, they become a villain.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about the legendary villains, every one of their stories goes back to something that happened to them that was wrong.
Yeah.
School shooters.
Yeah.
You go back, there was a pain inflicted on them. And so they're either going to become a villain, but what in our story, in the movies, right? What emerges is a guide. And the guide comes along and finds the hero and says, what are you doing? You got to get up. And this relationships develops between this guide who's got some experience and some wisdom, and this hero who's just doesn't need any help and is ticked off at the world, and they begin to do this thing. But eventually the guide helps the hero remember why they are where they are, and ask questions like, why are you even here? How'd you even get in this fight? What's going on? If you were free from this, what would you go do? And what happens if you don't do this? Then what happens? And the hero does this mixture of whining and crying and wrestling, but then the guide helps the hero develop a plan. The guide doesn't bring the plan. The plan's got to come from the hero, but he helps him develop it. And the hero goes on to success. And the guide goes back down the road and waits for the next hero. That's all I want to do with the rest of my life, man. I feel like that's how we should approach children's ministries. Parents are heroes.
Yeah.
I think that's what the church does. That's who we're just here because there are people who God has called. And listen, God hasn't called some people. We believe he's called everybody.
Yes.
But they got stuck. They got hit. And the fact that the hero is not always glad to see the guide show up, right? That's your job, right? So yeah. So that's what I want to live out. And I'm really excited about the opportunity that I have to meet some incredible heroes and watch as God moves in their heart and mind.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing of your life and your story. Man, this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
You're awesome. You have brought, I know your pastor loves you. I know that you have brought just a sense of, there are leaders that when you're in the room, before anybody says anything, you feel like the environment's a little warmer and a little kinder, and that's you. So thank you for being who you are, man.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
God bless you.
It's been awesome. Thanks for checking out this podcast. I hope this interview was a blessing to you. Like, share, subscribe, and get the word out, and let's indeed follow Jesus everywhere.